But we're now in 2016, so we're now 8 years on. We've got an international, global supply chain. It looks a little bit like this. We now move stuff around the world with the same ease as in the first industrial revolution. They used to move stuff around the same town. We talk to people the other side of the world using technology that's free. It's still very much a human supply chain, however. From picking stuff out of the ground, from the supplier's supplier, all the way through to the customer's customer. Humans are an integral part in that supply chain. And in fact, if you look at the manufacturing process specifically, these two pictures are 100 years apart, and they look incredibly familiar. People in lines making stuff. There's a downside to the human supply chain, and it's a downside of the second part of the efficiency and exploitation. So we're always looking to try and find ways to make more money, to make more profit. That's the nature of capitalism. And in doing so, unfortunately, there is a human cost in a lot of cases, from Tanzanian miners in working conditions that were outlawed in the 18th century in the United Kingdom, for example, child labor, slavery. You'll remember in the middle there, the Rana Plaza disaster in Bangladesh. So people had got very excited, specifically in the UK, about the whole concept of disposable fashion. That I could buy a t-shirt at a price point that means I could wear it out once and then just dispose of it. People then found out what the cost of disposable fashion actually was, the human cost. And of course, the consumer therefore has a choice. But even in developed nations, you've got the Turkish mine disaster there. These are people protesting against working conditions at Amazon, in the Amazon warehouses, and saying, hey, you treat us like robots. We have to walk 15 miles a day. This is inhuman. So now you have people protesting in Germany there. So what to do? Well, the global supply chain is still a human supply chain. For now. Because we're at the transition point. And we're not just at the transition point of another wave. I believe we're at the transition point of a mega wave, which was started with the first industrial revolution, and this is the end of the industrial age, and we are now at the transition point of a new age. And we're in the world, you've probably seen this before, it's been used a few times, but in 2016 we're in a world now where the rules are being upset. So, the world's largest taxi company doesn't actually own any vehicles. The world's most popular media company creates no content. The world's most valuable retailer owns no inventory. The world's largest accommodation provider owns no real estate. And the large communication companies own no infrastructure. And the world's largest movie house owns no cinemas. So this is a new world. This is a digital world that we're living in. We now live in a world where a 6-year-old company that lets you hail a car is actually worth more than the companies that make the cars. So as Tom Goodwin, who was the guy who originally came up with the first 4 of those statements, said in TechCrunch last year, clearly something interesting is happening. And what's happening is that the process of creating destruction is speeding up exponentially. So it took 51 years through Thomas Newcomen's atmospheric engine to be improved by James Watt, which allowed it to be used reliably in order to extract water from the mines, that allowed us to basically mine coal at a level to power the industry of moving people from the countries into the cities. So there's 51 years before any major innovation took place there. And I know Ian showed this earlier, this one, but 20 years it took for everything pretty much on that advert from Radio Shack to be put on that one product there. And the interesting thing is, Steve Jobs and Bob Wozniak, who were the founders of Apple, their favorite shop was Radio Shack, because that was where they used to go to buy the transistors and experiment in the garage, Wozniak's garage, and play around with stuff. And their product was effectively one of the key elements as to why people didn't go to Radio Shack anymore. In fact, we're in a world now where you have 17 million supercomputers in your pocket. So now I'm going to look into the audience for old people who remember the Cray 2 supercomputer. Anyone remember that? Oh, come on, it's not just me. So in 1985, this was very famous. I remember being on television quite a lot. 17 million it took for that. You can get the same processing power in 2011 for around about $700. And for $299 in 2015, only it's not one Cray supercomputer, it's the equivalent of 18. And now you can have it on your wrist if you want. Yeah. So what's happening? What's driving this? Well, as you may be aware, the thing that's driving this is something called Moore's law, that every 18 months to 2 years, the processing power transistor chip doubles, the price halves, and it's creating this exponential progression. What does exponential look like? Exponential looks a bit like this. So in 1980, for $3,500, I could buy 10 megabyte hard disk. This year, I can go onto Amazon, and for $54.99, I can buy a terabyte. So my price per gigabyte has changed from $349,500 in 1980, which means I've got 100,000 times more memory for 1.55% of the cost. That's exponential. So what's happened is, in the past, labor was cheap, specifically in the Western world, and data, of course, was incredibly expensive. Now it's the other way around. Labor is quite expensive, and data is increasingly becoming incredibly cheap. And it's not just the innovation, but there's also the diffusion of the innovation. So if we take this as an example, because of globalization, because of digitization, it took 75 years for 50 million people to be able to own and use a telephone. 38 years for radio, 13 years for TV, 4 years for internet, 3.5 years for Facebook, and earlier this year, just 19 days for 50 million people to download Pokemon Go. So again, we've got exponential innovation, but also exponential diffusion going on here, and adoption. But I'm talking to you about creative destruction, the impact of creative destruction. So if you just look at the smartphone, it effectively destroyed or severely disrupted the market for pretty much everything that was on there, from everything from the watches. Lots of millennials now don't own watches. The time is held on the phone. They don't need a watch anymore. From cameras, digital cameras were the future. Now the phone is the camera. Walkmans, dictaphones, all these things, 10 years ago, even GPS, which was seen as new and exciting tech, a lot of people don't need that anymore. They use their phone. And I like this quote from Elbert Hubbard, which said, "The world is moving so fast these days that anyone who said it can't be done is usually interrupted by the people who are doing it." And I want to use probably one of the best examples of that. So, the smartest guys on the planet, professors from MIT and from Harvard, Levy and Moraine, got together and in 2004 produced a book. The book was called A New Division of Labor, and it was looking at the computer age and how it's transforming the very nature of jobs. But in 2004, these people, who are the leading experts in their industry, who are the thought leaders from two of the most esteemed universities in the world, said, there are certain things that I cannot foresee a world where a computer will ever be able to handle the uncertainty and the different number of variables. For example, executing a left turn against incoming traffic involves so many factors that it's hard to imagine discovering the set of rules that can replicate the driver's behavior. And 6 years later, Google went and did it. 6 years, from absurdity to certainty. That's exponential.